Hello, all. Thank you for joining us for another DIAG conversation. I'm Ellie, co director of DIAG, Democrats for an Informed Approach to Gender. DIAG is a 501c3 nonprofit organization of lifelong Democratic voters working to depoliticize and shed light on the ideologically driven medical scandal and the associated harms that have resulted from the adoption of gender ideology and sex denialism. We're building a movement to shift the prevailing narrative around the experimental, dangerous medical practices that comprise sex trait modification, euphemistically known as gender affirming care, and to clear the path for a safer, saner, evidence based response to gender distress. Please visit our website at diag.org. That's di-ag.org. Please also check out our merch store. And if you'd like to help us continue and expand the work we're doing, please hit the donate button. DIAC believes in the liberal value of free speech and open discussion, which is part of why we host these spaces, to invite conversation on topics that have been left out of the public discourse. The opinions expressed by our guests are not necessarily the opinions of our organization. So, our recent spaces have looked at the broad societal impacts of gender ideology. We've discussed the trans-identified males in women's sport and prisons, the corruption of science in our institutions, and the legal battles over pediatric gender medicine. Today, we're going to look at the more personal side, the effects of gender ideology on vulnerable young men. Our guest is psychotherapist Joseph Burgo. He has worked with boys and adults with gender distress, including those who have chosen to re identify with their sex. Joe Burgo is the author of The Narcissist You Know, Defending Yourself Against Extreme Narcissists in an All About Me World, and Why Do I Do That? And his latest book, Building Self Esteem. His blog is called After Psychotherapy. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you for having me. Let's hope we get to actually finish it this time.
Yeah, fingers crossed, no more cyber attacks.
Yeah, right.
Uh, So, we've heard a lot in recent years about the surge in girls and young women with so called rapid onset gender dysphoria. That's ROGD. What's happening with boys and young men? Is there a similar trend?
I think so. It's not exactly the same as with the ROGD girls. As I was saying when we started last week, the problem is that it's hard to get consensus on this point. Most of the established authorities in this area, like Mike Bailey and Ray Blanchard, they really hold that there isn't a new cohort. That these boys are basically they're one of the original two cohorts. They identified either homosexual, transsexuals. These are young gay men who want to transition to be women, or autogynephiles. And I don't think that's true. I've been in contact with a lot of the parents in this space. I've worked with a lot of boys who don't fit either one of those categories. It seems to me there is a new cohort that doesn't fit into the autogynephile HSTS dichotomy. We could talk about what distinguishes them, how they're different from those other two, and how they're different from the girls.
Yeah, I'd like to know about that. Why don't you uh, why don't you define what the differences are here?
Um, Okay, so I think like the ROGD girls, they're somewhat quirky. I think they are quirkier. They've not fit in well with the other boys. They're usually, they tend to be either highly gifted, maybe on the spectrum, ADHD. There's some sort of issue there that makes them just a little unusual, and their social skills aren't great. So they've never really fit in terribly well. Often they were bullied for being different,
Mm.
and they're not gender nonconforming. They are definitely not. They don't display interest in typically female pursuits. All of the boys I've seen who fall into this category had stereotypically male interests. Um, so what happens to them is they've been bullied. they've been bullied out of the male hierarchy, so they don't feel that they belong. They might have a group of equally quirky friends, but they're not popular. They don't have a lot of friends. And because they're kind of sensitive in different ways, they've been deeply affected by the conversation around toxic masculinity and the patriarchy and Me Too and all of that. And they've absorbed a lot of social justice ideology. And um, they reach adolescence and they are often deeply troubled by their sexual impulses because they've been told these kinds of feelings are bad. They're evidence that you're a rapist or you're an oppressor. I've seen a number of boys who went on estrogen because they didn't want to have spontaneous erections. They felt
Mhm.
disturbed by, their sexual drive. And then gender ideology comes along and they see a way to opt out. It accomplishes a number of things. It gives them a different non-oppressor identity. So now they're a trans girl, trans woman. They get celebrated just like the ROGD girls do. You're treated as a hero, brave for coming out, and they get a lot of attention from girls. I mean, they're celebrated. Girls will help them do their hair, do their makeup. They get touch, they get physical contact, they get closeness. So it accomplishes a lot of things. It helps them escape from that kind of bullied loser identity that they grew up with, and it gives them this new access to women. Um, um, yeah. I mean, it feels like there's so many different factors coming into play all at the same time. I wrote an article about it called "The Perfect Storm" because it does seem like a number of things just came together at once.
Yeah, I knowing, folks in the boys group, this story, I know they collected some data on this. This seems so familiar that most of the young men fit that profile exactly. Some of them have girlfriends, long-term sexual relationships, and yet it's not enough to dislodge them from this, belief system. Can you also talk about that other cohort, the, autogynephile cohort, maybe define what that is for people, and then, what sets that apart?
Sure. Um, I was noticing today on X that apparently in the most recent episode of White Lotus, there's an autogynephile scene, which was kind of shocking. So it's hard for me to believe that anybody who follows this space doesn't know a little bit about what autogynephiles are. So they are what used to be, well, they are men who are sexually aroused by the idea of themselves as women. It's usually thought of as a paraphilia, and they're very different from either the HSTS, the gender nonconforming gay boys, or the ROGD boys. They tend to come out later. They've often been married. They've often had stereotypical male careers. They've been in the military, but they as they get older, they become increasingly consumed by this paraphilia, this fetish, if you will, and it takes over their lives, and they decide that they need to transition to become women later in life. So these are the ones that I think are causing most of the trouble these days. These are the tend to be the activists, the people who show up and harass Kelly J. Keene, or any of the other people speaking out in this space, Riley Gaines. I think they're driven by both hatred and envy, mostly envy of women, and they will like. I think there's a narcissistic element to it. It's a
Mhm.
narcissistic defense that they've developed, and like all extreme narcissists, if you challenge their delusion about themselves, they will try to destroy you. So I think they account for what we're seeing in the trans activist space.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, we see the anger certainly and the hostility. And, I've heard people talk about well, they want to categorize these boys as either AGP, that's autogynephile, or as becoming AGPs over time, the longer that they're in this. Do you, how realistic do you think that is, or is this really a separate category?
It's a really interesting question. I've seen a lot of adolescent boys, um, a lot of young men in their 20s, and out of the group I've seen, and I mean, I'm not talking vast numbers, I'm using under 20, but, like, only one of them was what I would consider like a proto AGP. He was being groomed online by older autogonophiles, and he struggled with terrible, terrible shame about himself, but was praised and rewarded, and was sending
Mhm.
pictures of himself wearing female clothes, and just. But I don't see that these are all proto AGPs. I think some of them might be. I think it's an interesting question. I think the ones who are likely to turn out to be AGP are probably the ones who are drawn to sissy porn early on, and
Mhm.
they're not all into sissy porn. I mean, there's this stereotype out there that they're all watching porn all the time, and it's this terribly degrading sissy porn that makes them into trans and will make them AGP. I don't think that's pervasive.
Okay, well, that's reassuring to know because it is troubling. For people who don't know what that is or are lucky enough not to know what that is, it is this really degrading pornography, I think, where males are put in these very, uh, yeah, degrading positions, but as females, right? They're mimicking female kind of degrading female roles.
Right, there's someone in the video that's humiliating them and stripping them of their manhood, and it's very sexualized. But I think I talked about this in my presentation in Killarney when I was talking about the sexualization of shame. I think these are the type of boys that are so deeply shame-ridden that it gets bound up with sex, with sexuality, so that the shame gets sexualized and made more manageable and even enjoyable in a perverse kind of way. But I don't think all of these boys are struggling with that level of shame, and I certainly don't believe that they're all turning to this kind of pornography. I really don't.
Okay. Well, yeah, I hope you're right on that.
Just as an interesting point, I was rereading this week Richard Reeves' book on men and boys, which I really recommend. He's really good about the systemic problems facing men and boys, not trans boys necessarily, but all young men and boys today. And he offered an interesting statistic. He said that the average 20-ish male who's using porn visits a porn site 3 times a week, and his average visit time is 6 minutes.
Wow.
Th
Okay.
that's that's not the impression you're getting
Right.
from when
No.
people talk about it. I mean, these are guys who are, for whatever reason, are stressed out or whatever, and they're getting a quick relief, and they're going on with their day. I mean, there is another profile. I've worked with these men where you've probably heard the term edging, where they are spending hours in masturbatory fantasy, watching pornography without ever reaching orgasm, and they just try to keep it going for hours and hours. I don't think that's the typical profile of these ROGD boys.
Well, that's also a relief because that sounds like a huge time sink for young people who are already kind of not moving towards adulthood.
Right.
And what a way to derail your your life. Um, you mentioned before about um, social justice, the sensitivity towards social justice issues, and how boys, these sensitive boys, can kind of get taken up by that and the feelings of shame or guilt around that. Um, that seems to be a newer phenomenon, for young people to be concerned about in general? Is this, how much does this contribute to what we're seeing in boys now?
I think it's huge, and I've talked about this somewhat in other presentations. I talked about it in my presentation at Denver, where there we and I don't want to overemphasize it too much. Where we do live in a culture that's kind of a misandric culture where everyone's down on men. Men are bad. Toxic masculinity really is a stand-in for masculinity. Everything about men is bad, and men should really be like women. I think some people might be familiar with the 2018 guidelines for working with men and boys that the American Psychological Association put out. And you should read it. It's a pretty shocking document from the foremost authority on psychology in our country, and it basically pathologizes everything about masculinity. I mean, there's nothing positive. So I do think this is very new. One of the things I've been researching lately is the ways in which other cultures helped boys come of age and make the transition to manhood. Going back to primitive hunter-gatherer cultures and their sort of rituals of manhood. To things like the Boy Scouts, where boys are taught certain values like chivalry or courage and a sense of responsibility to society. We used to understand that when boys hit puberty, there was this profound impact on them of testosterone, and they had all of this energy. I think Richard Reeves might call it that. A number of people call it male energy, but they become more aggressive. They become more competitive. They're more prone to risk taking. Their sex drive is higher. These are just biologically observable facts across cultures, and we used to understand that we needed to help those boys manage those impulses and enlist them in the service of protecting women and families in service to their country and culture. Um, we don't do that anymore. I just spent a lot of time reading guidebooks about puberty, those sort of books that a parent would buy for their teenage son as he's hitting puberty, or the parents would read it and the boy would read it. And there's nothing in there that really discusses um, just the force of testosterone. And what they really do is they take the blank slate approach to human nature. And this is lately what I've it's one of my big beefs is that this talk about human biology as if men and women are no different, that masculinity and femininity are 100% cultural constructs, and that we can shape men into being anything we need them to be. And that means making them more like women. I just think that's wrong. I think it's both nature and nurture. Oh, for sure, culture has an impact, and we can, you know, shape masculinity. We can guide boys in how to direct their energies, and we can teach them to be more responsible and respectful towards women. We can teach them chivalry. We can teach them all sorts of things, but you can't erase it. So I feel like right now with parenting of boys, we've got two strategies um, that are nothing like the constructive shaping one. Either we shame them for who they are, or we tell them that they're no different from girls and there's no reason why they can't be as empathic and gentle or whatever adjective you want. For women, I don't think those last two are helping boys to get through puberty. So I think this cohort of boys has come of age at a really strange time. Um, it's not just that gender, well, I mean, it's part of the same thing. Gender ideology is out there, but gender ideology is part of a larger ideology about human nature, the blank slate view of human nature. It's a very utopian, idealistic view of what people are like and how you can shape them. and they're completely ill-equipped to deal with puberty, with sex drive, with aggression, competitiveness. So I don't know. I feel a lot of empathy for these boys because and it's these they have good parents, you know, they have well-meaning parents. All of the parents that I've dealt with are great, are fully involved with their children. These are not neglectful, abusive parents. I think they're parents that have been blindsided by the culture and um, have really seen their boys kind of caught up in this ideology with no idea what to do about it and no real way to counter the kind of ideology that's being taught in schools and in their peer groups. So I don't know. It's a very strange time to be a boy.
I wanna stick with the school thing a little bit and this idea about teaching boys how to deal with adolescence and puberty. When I was in school for health ed, first they separated the girls and the boys, and we had no idea what the boys talked about, at all. They talked to girls about getting periods and all this stuff. And then we came together in a co-ed class, and then we can ask some, goofy questions. But they weren't talking about gender back then. And I assume it was focused on things like getting erections and your sex drive and getting someone pregnant and staying disease free and all these things. But now, with the focus, I don't, I haven't seen a regular sex ed curriculum. It's all infused with gender. And it doesn't seem like it's really helping young men deal with these realities of their physical bodies.
I agree. And you've pointed to the real problem is that sex education, which I don't know, I remember having it like in fifth grade,
Yeah.
sep- boys and girls separate. And then the group thing and lots of giggling, but it was very, very anatomical about what
Yep.
happened to your body, and that's so sex education has been replaced by gender ideology, and it also happens way younger.
Yep.
So you're introduced to these ideas of your gender identity maybe not aligning with your sex quote assigned at birth, and that you could be born in the wrong body, and it's all very confusing. So, you add that in there. So, I'm sorry, they're not being taught about how to cope with the realities of testosterone and what happens at, at puberty. What I'm seeing in all of these books is what they do is they wanna remove shame from everything. Like, so everything is okay, everything is normal,
Mhm.
nocturnal emissions are normal, spontaneous erections are normal. Masturbation is normal. You shouldn't feel ashamed of any of it. But they don't really distinguish between male sex drive and female sex drive. And they don't teach boys how to manage this huge surge of, I don't know, energy. It's on so many levels. I mean, anybody who's raised a boy knows what it's like. When they hit puberty, they just change. They become completely different. They're more aggressive, they're more sexual. So I don't know. You've got this gender ideology. I'm not sure how that helps boys to cope with their new sexuality, especially when, you know, in a different context, but in a pervasive way, they've been told that male sexuality is actually bad. It's abusive, that men are rapists, rape culture on campus. I don't know. I just think they're not prepared to deal with their sexuality, and they've been told that male sexuality is actually kind of bad. So what do they do with it when they hit puberty? They don't want it. They're often horrified by spontaneous. I mean, you know, I had a patient who went on estrogen just because he could not cope with spontaneous erections. Just like
Well,
horrified him.
yeah, it's interesting because on one hand you have that um, everything is normal, that normalization of everything, which does not give them, and because they're going to feel shame, they're going to feel embarrassment, they're going to feel all of the things that young boys have been feeling forever about this awkward time, and yet they're told that it's normal and they shouldn't have those feelings, so they don't really have a place to go with those
Yeah.
feelings or to process them. So it's not it's certainly not helping them, and the other part of it is then you step into the gender clinic, and if this is why a young, a teen is wanting to transition for whatever that means, the doctors aren't asking those questions. They're assuming that there's some other n- mythical belief system here that means they're, females trapped in a male body or whatever that is.
Right, they're not probing, the sources of shame that the boys feel about their sexuality. They're not looking at that. If the boys are uncomfortable with their sexuality, that just means they're in the wrong body. Um, but, they'll tell you everything's normal and you shouldn't feel ashamed of anything, but they don't teach you like, they don't say what's that statistic? I can't remember how many times a day the typical, young male thinks about sex. They
Oh,
don't
yeah.
they don't tell you that it's totally normal to be thinking about wanting to have sex with, like every woman you see. I don't I'm exaggerating. But you've probably I can't remember which one of the female detransitioners it was who said this, but she said that when she went on testosterone, she finally got male sexuality because she just wanted to, profane word, everybody. She just
Yeah.
wanted to have sex with everybody she saw. And I think I don't think that's all that unusual. Boys are like, from an evolutionary perspective, boys are designed to be interested in and ready to have sex at any given moment as a reproductive strategy. It's just built into us evolution-wise.
Yeah, and you cannot, you know, t teach it out of these kids, nor does it seem reasonable to try it and try to do that, but you can medicate it out of these boys, sadly.
You can indeed. I mean, the the other thing about estrogen, we know that it has a depressive effect on boys, and it depresses your sex drive as well. Plus, then they're taking spironolactone, and then they're like taking some
Yeah.
other testosterone suppressant. And the other thing, I was reading something last night. I realized that I wonder if antidepressants have, which they give to boys also,
Mhm.
if those have, an effect on the sex drive. I think they do. I mean, in most people, they tend to, like, destroy your sex drive. So you can give them estrogen and an antidepressant, and they've got no sex drive left.
And but it's not gonna make them, feel better. It's not gonna improve their mental health. It's going to kind of sink it because
Absolutely. I mean, because what I'm seeing a lot of lately is these low motivation boys
Mhm.
they've come of age, so they can do what they want. Um, they may have dropped out of
Oops. Joe, speaking of dropped out,
my ringer turned off.
there you go. Now we can hear you.
Yeah, what my ringer was on.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, I
That's
had turned it off. Um, so what you see is these boys who are on estrogen and some sort of T blocker, and they're completely sapped of motivation. I've consulted with a number of parents recently whose boys are 20, 21, living at home, um, basically shut-ins, no no social life, no involvement with other people, maybe playing video games, hardly interacting with their families. I mean, they're depressed, they're demotivated, and they feel on some level they feel like losers and failures because they're unable to engage in adult life. But I think by that point they're really frightened of trying to engage in the world and trying to achieve something real. I mean, you've probably seen this before, that with trans identified kids, suddenly the idea of a future and long-term goals goes out the window, that, transition becomes
Yeah.
everything.
Yep.
Um, so I think what's really tragic is that, particularly with the boys, they have no opportunity to, like, build self-esteem, to do something, achieve something, acquire a skill, put it to use that might make them feel better about themselves, because they're just increasingly isolated from anything that would challenge their belief about themselves. But go ahead.
Yeah, it that I you look at the gender affirming care transition stages, and there are these goals. I think about video games in the same way, is this feeling of accomplishment and these goals and these tasks and, calendar days you can mark off, whereas in the rest of their lives, they're stagnating like a lot of young men, but this gives them these kind of measurable this progress that they're making towards nothing.
No, I know. It's as if transition, it becomes the be all and the end all. It's the only achievement that they need to worry about, and their future goes out the window. It's tragic.
So, let's go back to shame a little bit and social media. Um, we've seen like girls being very susceptible to social media and shaming on social media, but it doesn't seem like a very male thing. I could be wrong, but what about the susceptibility to the social media aspect of this?
I honestly, I don't know. All I can say is that from my experience with the boys I've seen, and it hasn't been a big deal. They were, by the time they got to the point where they were encountering gender ideology, they already felt like they were excluded and losers, and they were not popular. They weren't part of any, of the important friend groups. They didn't need social media to do that to them. Um, and the other thing I wanted to mention about these boys is that you occasionally will see more than one together, but they don't cluster in the way that the girls do. These boys are more loners. They're not transitioning as part of a friend group because so and so is also doing it. You know, they're
Right.
they're they're already loners. They're already lone wolves. They don't fit in. They don't feel like they belong. So I don't know. I don't think they're spending a lot of time on social media comparing themselves to other people. I don't
Yeah.
I I don't think so.
And but shame in and of itself is clearly a motivating factor for them. So what is it about shame that is such a powerful force, both, you know, really for anybody?
Yeah, well, I don't know. I think shame kind of explains everything in my book. Um, so if I can give a little lecture on how we got shame. I mean, shame evolved in the human species. Evolutionary psychologists think that shame evolved, our capacity to experience shame evolved as a means of enforcing conformity to tribal values, so that if you did something that was against the norms within your tribe, that jeopardized the safety of the tribe and other people, then you would be shunned. You would be treated as an outsider, and that experience, being on the outside, is shame. It's like the fundamental shame experience is being an outsider, being treated as if you do not belong to the group. And, so shame has value because it's such an awful experience that people, will do anything to avoid experiencing it. Hence, the kind of conformity to these ridiculous ideas in our culture that people feel that they have to, say that they believe in, because otherwise they'll be shunned by their friend group. They'll be shamed and shunned because they hold unacceptable views to the group. It's incredibly powerful. It can be really useful, but If you have a persistent feeling of shame that you don't belong, you don't have value within the group, you have no role in the hierarchy, you serve no useful purpose. I mean, it's utterly toxic and destructive to any sense of self-worth. So, I mean, I think that an ideology that offers you this escape mechanism from the feeling of being damaged goods by giving you this brand new identity. I mean, it's unbelievably appealing. I have no trouble understanding how both boys and girls succumb to the ideology. You know, when you look at who it is, you know, it's tends not to be the really popular, successful, attractive kids who are succumbing, you know, to gender ideology. Lisa Lippman said that, you know, they're the quirky girls, they're a little bit outsiders. Um, and with the boys, I think it's just even more so. They're outsiders. They feel often about themselves as if they're losers, and you know, then you give them this way to become somebody else and escape from that horrible feeling. I mean, it's I don't know. It's just really sad.
But then, there are aspects of this that are also shameful. I mean, they're causing anguish in their families. They're, going into the girls' locker rooms, and there is pushback about this. They're taking medals from them. There's certainly massive, retribution for that. There's the bullying that they in turn do about the language and the pronouns and the naming. So why isn't why aren't those things, they don't feel shame about those things?
No, because they're making everybody else feel shame, right? It's what bullies do. Bullies often have some major shame in their own background. And what they do is they project it into other people, humiliate them, so as a way of getting rid of their own shame. So when you have someone who is trans identified and they've developed this idealized new self, to deny all that shame they felt. That is, by the way, the central dynamic in extreme narcissism. That's the subject of my book on narcissism, is the creation of this idealized false self as a way to deny and distance yourself from all of the shame that you feel at your core. So, you know, there are many ways of dealing with that shame. And the primary one is to assign it to somebody else, treat them in such a way so that they will feel inferior and humiliated. So then you get this grandiose feeling of being superior to them. That's the dynamic at the heart of bullying. And I think you see this with the trans rights activists is like, everything they do is about humiliating other people. Well, it's just a tell to me. These are people who are deeply shame ridden in flight from themselves and are dealing with their shame by trying to humiliate other people and impose the shame on them. Does that make sense?
It does, and it's, certainly I think in talking to, many parents about this, their their kids, their identified kids have gone from, incredibly sweet, very attached um children, especially the boys, to what seem like, monstrous narcissists. Nobody wants to pin I don't know if it's a diagnosis, but a label like that on a teen. But and maybe, we all say, well, teens are somewhat narcissistic anyways. Their world revolves around themselves. That's kind of a given. But this is that, on literal steroids.
Well, the word you use, diagnosis, I think is the problem. I hate diagnosis. I hate the way our profession has become medicalized, so that we have to have all of these precise scientific sounding diagnoses with nine diagnostic criteria, and you select seven. It's like pseudo scientific, really. So instead of thinking about, oh, this kid is a narcissist because he fits diagnostic these diagnostic criteria that are in the DSM-5, I instead think of narcissism as a strategy for coping with shame. Now, I will I we all do this, and I'll give you an example of how we all do this all the time. So, um, I use this example in my book. So you're a man, and your wife says, or you're a woman and your husband says, it doesn't really matter. Would you pick up the dry cleaning on the way home from work today? And you say, oh, sure, I'll do that. And then you just forget. You completely forget about it. And when um, you get home, your wife says, your husband says, did you get the dry cleaning? And you immediately make up a lie and you say, "Oh, I'm sorry, work was just really busy. It just drove it out of my mind. I didn't have time. I'm sorry. I'll do it tomorrow." And then your wife kind of sighs in disappointment and says something like, "Never mind. I'll do it myself." And then you get really angry and you say, "Why do you always have to be so critical? Why are you so harsh? I told you work was hard today. I just forgot. What's the big deal?" That's a narcissistic reaction to shame. Now, most people will then kind of calm down and later on in the evening say, "Yeah, I'm sorry. I was an asshole. Um, I will get it tomorrow," and you'll back down from that. But that effort to make excuses for yourself, to deny responsibility, and to blame somebody else, in this case, for being harsh and judgmental. That's a narcissistic strategy for coping with shame. Um, if you if that becomes a character trait, if it becomes habitual so that that's the way you always are, then you see something like what we consider to be, a confirmed narcissist, or what these trans-identified teens are like when they are brutally defending their idealized false self, this new image of themselves from questioning parents or anybody else who challenges it. They become brutal. They'll attack you for questioning them. They'll say really hurtful, I mean, unbelievably hurtful things. They'll try and humiliate you. I mean, I have so much, having been through it myself, I have a lot of sympathy for the parents who have to endure this kind of treatment from their trans-identified teens because they're brutal.
Well, and then, I look at that becomes a cycle. Now they've done something shameful on top
Right.
of their behavior, and then they have to push back even more because they've been horrible and they don't have the maturity to apologize. And, rarely will they step back and say, yeah, I was upset about this, or I'm sorry, or whatever, because, most parents would go like, that's okay. But they can't make that jump. And so they're building, it's like they're creating a little wall, a little walled in room of walls of shame that it's very difficult to escape.
I do. I think so. And sometimes it makes me really sad and kind of hopeless. Is how do you help these kids get out of that room they've locked themselves into? Because, like you said, I mean, they've done so many hurtful things. I mean, to people who loved them and brought them up and took care of them. How do they ever acknowledge that shame and guilt? How do you ever God, I mean, first of all, you've got the shame about yourself that you're trying to cope with by creating this false self. And then you do all of these things that create more shame. And you've just got you've got this unmanageable amount of shame that all you can do is like insist for years and years. It takes a long time to step back from that kind of defensive posture and to endure the level of guilt and shame you're going to have to feel if you detransition.
And by the time someone has the capacity, the maturity, and the kind of insight about themselves to seek meaningful therapy. So, you know, you're seeing someone who's kind of gotten to that point. Where are most of those young men at? Are they recognizing that they've created this kind of existence built on shame about what they've done, or is it kind of a process to get them to understand it? Where are they generally at?
Yeah, it's different with different cohorts. So I have a number of um, detransitioned men in my practice who I mean, we're talking full surgery men, who realized that they were gay. And they're dealing with primarily with, coming to terms with their own sexuality. And there's just this huge, huge amount of regret and unbearable regret when you think about it, because there isn't, there's no going back. Really. I mean, it's different. I often talk about, like, if you look at Prisha's story or Chloe's story, these are sad stories. These women were, abused by the medical system, and they had their breasts removed, and they'll never be able to breastfeed their children. But Prisha has a baby. There's, she's celebrated. Um, a gay man who no longer has a penis and may have had his prostate relocated during his vaginoplasty no longer has a sex life of any kind, and would be undesirable to any other gay man at that point. As one of my patients once said, yeah, yeah, my dating pool is freaks, perverts who have some weird fetish. Because gay men want to be involved with um, other gay men who have a penis. I mean, it's just kind of the bottom line. So they're dealing with that kind of unbearable grief. I don't even know how else to put it. It's just sometimes, it's just sitting in session with this unspeakable pain and not saying anything. That's what that's what sessions are often like. It's so much. I've Some of the autogynephiles that I see, um, they're not they're dealing with shame, but they've been dealing with it for a long time. I mean, they're trying to understand what drives this peculiar paraphilia they've got. And, the ones that lived as women for a time didn't they did not have surgery, my cohort. Um, they're not dealing with the kind of shame that you and I are talking about the deeds they've done to their families and the hurts they've caused. And interestingly, I don't have the boys that I see that are in this ROGD group, I don't have any detransitioners from that group yet.
Hmm.
My detransitioners are all in the other two groups. I do see boys that are still trans identified in the ROGD group.
And are that's a little I don't think, parents aren't gonna be too happy to hear that the boys aren't really coming out of it, but is kind of what we see. Um, so the boys who are still trans identified, I mean, are they able to engage in meaningful therapy?
It depends. I've gotten more discouraged about that over time. Um, I had I've had a number of intakes with young men over the last few months, after engaging with the parents, and I'm always trying to weed out the boys who are only gonna come because their parents say they have to go. And parents are either self-deceived or they're not being fully honest with me often, but I've had many sessions that last 15 minutes because the boys show up and they have no interest in engaging in meaningful therapy. And just finally come to the conclusion that you can't do therapy if you don't have a patient. I mean, you can't. You have to have a willing partner. Yeah, it's hard enough as it is with someone who's an engaged partner and that work together. But if you have to, you know, I call it practice psychotherapy with one hand tied behind your back, and you have to disguise the fact that you do not believe in this, fictitious identity. I don't know. I've not some people may be able to do it. I can't do it. I'm not effective that way, and I've just I'm really rigorous now about making sure that um the boys want to be there. I've got a couple more consultations I'm going to do this week, and we'll see. There are some boys who are like that. They're open-minded, and they're kind of really it's really enjoyable to work with them. I mean, painful, but enjoyable to work with them because they're willing to look at it. But most of them, I think, are just so defended against that, that shame-ridden self that they're just not available.
It really makes me wonder what happens when a boy goes to an affirming therapist. I mean, there can't be any honest engagement there because if the goal is to affirm, it doesn't seem I don't know what you'd be working on. Maybe
Well,
affirming more? I don't know.
well, I think it's immersion in victim ideology is a big part of it. Um, I've done a lot of reading lately about what's happened to the psychotherapy profession and what gender affirming care actually looks like, and it's pretty appalling. Gender affirming care is steeped in social justice ideology, and it relies most heavily on the minority stress
Mhm,
theory. And which, for people who don't know what that is, it's basically it originally involved out of people noticing that gays and lesbians seem to have a higher percentage of mental health difficulties than the general population. And the theory was put forward that because they were in this minority, in this not very well tolerated minority, the stress of that experience caused them to feel anxious or depressed, which I think is a completely valid idea. It's now become generalized to cover everything, so that anything that's wrong with you um, is a result of living in a transphobic culture in which people do not accept you. And it's why they'll talk. You hear these ridiculous claims about it's a trans genocide. Like it's just such nonsense. But it's important to preserve this sense of being an intolerated, persecuted minority. That's part of the identity, and then you have to lean into that, and that means you have to get involved in activism to defend the rights of persecuted trans people. Um, there's no sense of psychotherapeutic exploration in the way that I learned it, because every psychological disorder is attributed to the minority stress theory. I just there was a book that came out a couple years ago that was released by the American Psychiatric Association, called Gender Affirming Care. And I read through the whole thing, and there isn't a single case in there in which the comorbid conditions, like the usual ones, like anxiety, depression, or an eating disorder or self-harm, they're all viewed as a result of intolerance because of the minority stress syndrome, and the cure is transition, always. They'll even say that, like, they literally say that frank psychosis should not be a bar to, like, getting gender affirming care, because as long as you can engage with the psychiatrist, the rest of it's just because you haven't been able to be your true self. So it's pretty shocking. There's nothing psychotherapeutic about the practice of gender affirming care.
So I'm just trying to figure it out. I wanna get back to the profession, towards the end. Um, in looking at this pathway, that they are, promoting as kind of the answer, I mean, in the gender critical camp, um, we would say that, adopting a trans identity is a maladaptive coping mechanism. But, you've seen this range of patients. Are we wrong? Are there some people for whom this really was the best solution, and thank goodness it's available for them? Um, is living as the opposite sex, whatever that means, is that a reasonable path?
Yeah, this is the $64,000 question. I mean, I certainly know people personally like I know Buck Angel personally, and um, I don't usually use preferred pronouns, but I will refer to Buck as he in this case. Buck knows he's a biological female. He knows he did not change sex, and he struggled for many years, decades, trying to come to terms with his quote gender dysphoria. And he says that he's much happier this way than the other way, that this relieved a lot of his distress. I'm inclined to take him at face value, and to believe him. I think there's a very, very small number of people who, after years of therapy, after trying everything else in their 30s, that maybe this is what will bring them relief, but it's a vanishingly small number, and I'd like to believe that if they had really good therapy, someone who could talk about gender dysphoria as shame in the way that you and I are talking about it today, that they wouldn't have had to make that decision. But I don't know. I don't other than Buck, I don't know those people. I think these days they tend to keep quiet. Those people, the transsexuals, as they refer to themselves, used to just like they just wanted to blend in, right? They wanted to live their own life. They weren't activists, and then their life has kind of been ruined by the advent of autogynephiles and trans rights activists. So that whereas 10 years ago, you know we were all pretty tolerant. I mean, we all had that experience of um, seeing a man who was attempting to come across as a woman, and we wouldn't make a big deal about it, right? I have a good friend of mine who has said that she has numerous experiences of seeing trans women, trans identified men presenting as women in female bathrooms over her life. She's the same age as me. And that it was always this kind of embarrassed encounter. And the feeling she got from those people was, please, I'm just doing the best I can. Don't, don't confront me. I'll be out of here in a minute. I think that's the way it used to be. And I think that there are some people, for whatever reason, that trying to present as the opposite sex brings them some kind of relief. I mean, they were pretty tormented before. I would not want to make it illegal for anybody of that age to have access to some kind of treatment. I certainly don't think any minor children should be able to do anything medical. And I sometimes wonder if it should be you can't do anything before you're 26 and your brain is fully developed. But there does seem to be this weird tiny minority of people who has always existed.
Yeah, I think, that's a tough one, especially when we know that the medical care is introducing illness and that,
Right.
for a lot of these, what we're seeing is that their mental health is not at all improved.
Right.
Um, this is, it's, for some, they just don't make it, you know,
No.
post transition. It's, this is not a cure for suicide, obviously. Uh,
No, I mean, and what the suicide rate is elevated for post surgical um, trans identified men, isn't it? I
yeah,
mean, it's a
yeah,
super high. If I had a conversation with somebody, who's pretty knowledgeable, I might be talked into the position that we should just outlaw these treatments 100%. I think that's a defensible position. I'm just not quite there yet. I mean, for everybody, that they should never be allowed.
yeah. I think it's, that is the big question of the time. And certainly because of what we've seen with young people, um, and we also know that no switch gets flipped at 19 or 18. So, it's just winds up being a really dangerous option that's just too readily available. And we're not, as a society, able to have the conversation. So, um, that's made it kind of impossible to
Yeah,
really understand what's a
yeah.
reasonable medical pathway, or if there is one. Um, so the family members who of the young man that you deal with families as well, or just you're just talking to the young men themselves?
Well, I don't do family therapy per se, where I've got everybody together in the same room because I've never been any good at doing that, and I find it's complicated enough. But whenever I see a young person, I will also consult with the parents, and I'll see them once every 2 or 3 months, and I will talk with my client, my patient first, because, the client holds the privilege and I can't discuss anything with his parents unless I get permission. So we'll have a session beforehand and we'll talk about what I'm allowed to talk to the parents about. And then I'll meet with the parents and help them understand what's going on and help them with strategies for coping with the situation. And then increasingly lately, I have felt um, more effective consulting just with the parents, especially in cases where the kids aren't willing to come to therapy. I'm I've done I really find this actually pretty gratifying, and I think I can be helpful, particularly with the kind of the failure to launch kids. I'm seeing a number of parents who have the kids, they've come of age, but they're not out of the house, they're not working, they're not going to school. They just kind of reverted to childhood and helping them understand their kid and devise strategies to help these kids move along to become, excuse me, to become adults.
And those are kids who are trans identifying, or just the
They're
male
trans
children?
ide- they're trans identifying. But what I find interesting is they're not, so many of these boys just don't put a lot of effort into their trans appearance.
Yeah, yeah,
They don't look all that feminine. A lot of them dress in, very classically boy ways, and maybe they'll have a little makeup, or maybe they'll wear their hair longer, or you know, earrings. I don't know, but they don't. They're not making a huge effort. But they are trans identified, and many of them are on Estradio.
yeah. It seemed just like a parking place for them while they, don't adult. It's
Exactly.
a place. So, you know, talking to parents and knowing parents, it doesn't seem like there's much other than kind of standard parenting strategies, but certainly once a kid hits 18, there's really not much parents can do in terms of, because this influence by then is so strong in their kids. And parents are painted as the enemy, unless they're completely affirming, and even if they are, sometimes that doesn't matter either. It seems like a pretty futile stage to be in while your kid is lost to this.
I disagree. I think there's a lot parents can do, and um, I think the mistake that a lot of parents make with their kids, and we're talking about the ones who have come of age, they're adults, they can take estradiol if they want, is they allow them to live as children in their home, and they allow them not to have any responsibility. So one of the conversations I have with parents is like trying to assess, well, what limits are you comfortable imposing? Like, I mean, I don't think it should be acceptable for a 20-year-old boy to live at home, to do no chores, to not contribute anything to the family, and to eat alone and play video games. I don't think parents should enable that. And yeah, I just don't. I think you can, maybe there's not much you can do about the ideology, but you cannot enable this regression to childhood.
Yeah, that seems to me like the basics. Like the trans identity is a layer, a really destructive, terrifying layer on top of it. But the other part is just the parenting part of someone who is not, who is under invested, underperforming. in the household. And I do think that that problem, I mean, people talk a lot about these, that it's the classic son living in the basement, playing video games all day. So it's not particular to this cohort of trans identified. Trans is like just another layer that complicates things and gives them a dangerous medical pathway to on top of the other problems.
Totally. But I do think that trans identification often reflects a terror about growing up.
Hmm.
Um, I think that's like at the core of a lot of it. They don't want to. They're terrified of accepting adult responsibility, of meeting the demands of an adult world, having to be responsible for themselves. So I think just because someone is trans identified, our parenting roles don't stop. And it's an interesting question. I was talking to Stephanie Wynn about this, and I've never actually told a parent this, but I sometimes think that why shouldn't a parent say, "Look, you're living in my house. I'm paying for everything. You don't contribute anything, and you have to follow my rules and meet my expectations. And if you're not willing to do that, you need to move out." I mean, I've never gone that far, but I do try and explore with parents just how far they're willing to go. Like, what limits will you impose? You know?
Just to clarify for people, Stephanie Wynn is another therapist.
Yeah, and she
Um,
has a podcast called Some Kind of Therapist, and
right.
I was on that with her last year sometime talking about these issues.
Yeah, so here, this is where the trans identity differentiates these kids from other kind of, you know, lost teens, is that estrangement, people are terrified. Parents are terrified of estrangement. It is so common, whether you affirm your child or not. And so that threat of, um, yeah, you don't like it. Well, I'll never see you again. I'll never talk to you again. I mean, that is so supported and encouraged in this ideology that I think it paralyzes parents and keeps them from laying down the line like that. They have to be really brave, but also willing to accept the inevitability that they may never see their child again. I mean, I know too many parents
Well,
who not seen their child, don't know if their child is dead or alive, and it's been years, and
right.
it's such a trauma. It's so cruel.
No, I know. And I was going to say to you, well, you know the parents group. You know that this happens. They will. The threat of losing contact with your child is real, and a lot of these kids, they blackmail their parents with it. They extort support from them. It's just ugly. It's ugly and painful, and I have complete sympathy with the parent who really cannot um, set strong limits because they're terrified of never seeing their child again. I totally get it. I do not believe that that's helping the kid, but I get it.
Yeah, so many aspects of this that, these kids adopt are antithetical to helping them because it cordons them off from the people who love them the most and are there to support them. I mean, this is the problem with the schools, and the clinicians who are triangulating with these kids.
Right.
That it basically it is separating them from their support structure. It's cruel on all faces there. I know you said that you're not seeing the ROGD boys um, coming in for the most part as at, coming in as for meaningful therapy engagement yet. I mean, what do you think the trajectory is going to be for these boys? So that most of them from the kind of the main group, I think, are probably uh, late teens, early 20s now, um, probably medicalized but floundering.
Yeah, it's I don't know. I don't know what the trajectory is. We know that the time to desistance, what is it, 7 to 10 years, they think? That it
Yeah.
takes that long. So, It's still early with a lot of these guys, um, and I don't know. I don't know what's gonna happen with the HST, the young gay men who who decide to desist or detransition. It was, it was very clear to them at some point that the kind of sex they were thinking about and fantasized about was gay sex. They wanted to have gay sex, and they ultimately came to miss having their penis. So there was a motivating event or realization. I don't know. I'm not sure yet what that would be with the ROGD boys. Um, a certain level of misery at some point, recognizing that it was a failure, that you didn't really succeed in becoming somebody new.
Yeah, I think it's the jury's out because we don't really know what society will look like at that point. You wonder if this is kind of an isolated. I mean, I hear stories that that young people in middle school and high school now are kind of pushing away from this. They
Yes.
roll their eyes, which means you're going to have this isolated cohort, trapped in the ideology. None of their older peers and none of their younger followers are going to. So they'll be stuck generation, this isolated generation, and it's heartbreaking to think about.
It
Uh,
really is, but I do think that's what's happening. We've all heard these stories anecdotally now about what's happening with the next generation. Plus, I think in this country, the tide has turning. I think people are waking up to the dangers of gender ideology. I think, just like the no men and women's sports is an 80-20 issue now. I mean, we're in a really different place. And I think
yeah,
when, we've got a couple dozen detransitioner lawsuits that are, advancing through the courts. Once we get some big verdicts, I think like with the other praises, the other cult things that happened in our profession, it'll go away really quickly. Um, and then it's like going to be this generation that's stranded. Um, and it is absolutely heartbreaking. But, I've often said, like, if I was seeing somebody who had a delusion 30 years ago, say this person had whatever the delusion was, there would always be like reality backing me up there. Like I could feel confident that that delusion was not true and that reality would back me up if I were to make interventions, gentle interventions based on challenging that delusion. That has not been the case for the last 10 years. It's like reality is not backing me up.
right.
And in fact, they might come for my license if I speak about reality. So I'm hopeful that as reality takes hold a little bit more and we return to a sane perspective on sex and gender, that the next generation of kids aren't going they're not going to face this. It will be different. But I don't know. This is a lost generation. It really is heartbreaking.
Yeah, I hear stories. I did some reading about the people who were caught up in the recovered memory,
Right.
um, that whole mess, and how many of those young people never came back. They to this day they believe that they were molested by parents and family members, and they don't, they don't shake out of it, and it's just, it's another estrangement situation. Um, so I can't, if you look at that, it is hard to be hopeful because I think there are some parallels, obviously, but um, I think it'll depend, yeah, what society does with this because the people with recovered memory syndrome weren't living out as, there wasn't a they weren't trying to blend into society as a certain thing, whereas all these young people are going to be living day in and day out with this need for validation, and I think that could get very exhausting. Um,
Well, but
especially.
I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier about the shame and guilt these people feel for the way they treated their loved ones. I think those recovered memory syndrome kids, they often destroyed their parents' lives by accusing them of molestation, and they did incredible damage. And I think it's very hard to step back and accept the guilt for having hurt someone needlessly, without any basis like that. Helen Joyce always says that the people who are going to defend, you know, transgender ideology the most are going to be the parents who supported their kids in medical transition, because then they would have to face the fact that they harmed their own children, and they'll never be able they just will never be able to accept it. And I think there are unbearable levels of guilt. There are just things that you just cannot bear to face, and you have to stay in denial about them, and the price might be that you never resume a relationship with the person whose life you destroyed.
Yeah, this is, th- it's an the thing about this cohort that's kind of interesting is that, we do have this high proportion of kids who are on the spectrum. And I don't know if that changes that response. On the other hand, yeah, I do think a lot of these boys are incredibly sensitive, and that's why they're there, is because they feel so bad about being male and all the toxic masculinity and the sex drive and all this stuff, that you have a combination of kids who maybe, in terms of understanding their emotions and their impact and relating to people, might be not the same as others, but at the same time highly sensitive. So that really, who knows how what effect that has on their future pathway and finding their way out of this.
Well, and that the kids who are on the spectrum, they've we've got all this idea now about there is this spectrum, and as with everything, we try and remove the stigma from everything. So that this is just neurodiversity. There's nothing to be ashamed about. These people are just different, and they often have incredible gifts, and blah blah blah. I mean, if you see, this is what we do with all kinds of pathology now: is we try and remove the stigma and the shame associated with everything, so that that everything is okay. Well, that might be true, with adults who might be convinced to think that way, but these kids who are on the spectrum are like, shunned and teased and mocked as kids because they don't they don't know how to socialize very well. They misread cues. They're not they It's not that they don't have empathy, it's just that they don't know how to interpret it. They don't know what it means. So their social skills are poor. Other kids don't like them. They don't want to play with them. They're shunned. I mean, the shame about being on the spectrum of being different, neurodiverse is, yeah, it's profound. And I think people often make this mistake of thinking that just because adults now, enlightened adults, are so tolerant about everything, that everything's fine now. Like the thing that drives me a little bit crazy is that people think that, oh well, we've had Obergefell, we have gay marriage, and we had Will and Grace, and everybody, adult, pretty much all adults are accepting of gay people, so it's fine to be gay. Well, that might be true. I don't think it's totally true either, but what's also true is that still kids and early adolescents still police gender conformity. They are ruthless and brutal. They're mean to kids who don't fit the gender norms. That's still true. Feminine gay boys are still bullied. They're still mocked and teased. That hasn't changed. Just because we're a society more tolerant of gay men, that doesn't mean that children are. Children are brutal.
Yeah, they are. It's true. It's true. And we do know, yeah, the bullying is such a big thing. Um, and so ridiculously common. And I think now that we have these much more, things like restorative justice and where the schools aren't effective really in curtailing the bullying. From what I've seen, it's
Those
they're not
programs don't work as far as I
they
can
don't work.
tell.
Yeah,
Yeah,
they don't work
yeah.
at all. Um, okay, I want to talk just briefly about th- how the medical interventions are. Those can happen very, very quickly, and so there is obviously a lot of fear for parents of minors, and also as they get into their later teens. Is there a way to interrupt this fixation and what seems like an inevitable path for these young men? Because pretty much all the parents that I know, eventually their kids um, go on estrogen.
Yeah, that's been my experience too. I haven't found any way of averting that possibility, and I've also known parents who, like, had, sort of contracts and, like, "We will pay for your education, but you have to agree not to go on estrogen," and the kids agree to it, and then they just lie.
Yeah,
They just get it anyway. So I don't know how you stop that. Here's just an interesting little detail I found out recently, I think I talked about this at Denver, is that there's this weird benefit to being on estrogen for these boys. And I'm not saying it's good. I don't mean that. But I've known a number of kids who were on the spectrum and who had kind of not much access to their emotions, um, who went on estrogen and suddenly had an emotional life that they hadn't had before. I've heard several boys speak very feelingly about what it's like, to cry for the first time, to have emotions. So it's just one of those weird paradoxical things that doesn't sound like a really bad thing. I think the price to pay is like way too high, but they are reluctant to give it up once they go on it. And if you combine that with, the relief they get from their sex drive, it's hard to get them off of it.
well, but some of them, I mean, aren't they in relationships? I know of young men who are in relationships, uh, regular, sexual relationships with people. So losing that you would think that would become not a good thing.
You would think so, wouldn't you?
You would.
Um, but in my experience, it doesn't seem to either. I've got boys who are in relationships. I don't know how, they strike me as not deeply sexual. I mean, there's some, sexuality to it, but it often feels more like, cuddly and affection, and they're like kids.
Interesting. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I think it's part of that kind of stagnating in late adolescence.
right. Right. I mean it could be that my clients are keeping secrets from me, but I don't think so. It just the way they describe their sex life is just it's just kind of innocent in a way, you know?
Yeah. I wonder how that'll, but their partners eventually are going to are not going to be are not going to remain.
Right.
Um so I one final question, then we'll take questions. Your profession has been incriminated in this movement as facilitating these delusions and the fixations. So, where do you see psychotherapy headed in the coming years as this story shifts and the impact becomes more visible?
Well, I think the professional bodies and most of the training institutes are irredeemable, and we have to build new programs because you're not learning how to do therapy anymore. You're being taught social justice activism in the professions. So I think there has to be like a complete secession. We have to build new organizations, and we have to teach a new generation of people how to do soul therapy. So, for instance, one of the organizations I belong to, probably most listeners are familiar with Therapy First.
Hmm.
Um, we're putting together a program, a 1 year certificate program that will launch in the fall. That will be, a a condensed version of what I went through as a psychoanalyst, which is, there'll be a selection of readings. There will be individual supervision weekly on an ongoing basis on cases from a psychodynamic perspective, and then there'll be group process where we'll talk about cases as a group. Um, that's not happening so much anymore, and the ideas that I grew up on, the British object relation school, psychodynamic psychotherapy, psychoanalysis as a whole, that's just not it's not being taught in the way it used to be. So we need new institutions. I think the APA is just, well, it's an embarrassment, honestly.
Do you think you'll see I don't know what those I know I spoke to someone who said that the AAP, the American Academy of Pediatrics, is losing memberships
Right.
as this. Do you think the APA is also losing membership, or are those psychologists already kind of brainwashed into seeing this as reasonable?
I don't know about their membership levels, but I certainly know, like on Twitter, there's an awful lot of PhD psychologists who are, ranting about this sort of ideology and the capture of the training institutions. I don't know if your viewers are familiar with J.D. Haltkin. He's a PhD psychologist who I follow, and he had a series of guest posts on his Substack written by a candidate in one of the training institutes, and it's just appalling what goes on now. It's just basically social justice indoctrination. It's anti-male. It's full of the critique of masculinity. And this guy dropped out. And I think a lot of people do. They just drop out, and we just have to build new institutions. That's going to take some time. And then I think eventually, um, those organizations will fade in influence. And I think, the scandal when the Scrimetti ruling comes out, there was just so many unbelievable revelations about, the well, it was just a scandal what came out of Alabama.
Yeah.
Um, and what a joke WPATH is. Like, once this gets exposed more thoroughly, because there's been a huge resistance to accepting casts in America, but I don't think that they can hold out forever. I think there's just too much evidence. So eventually, it will happen. It's not happening as fast as any of us want.
Yeah. Snail's pace. I mean, for
Yeah,
people with kids, snail's pace.
yeah.
But yeah, we're certainly in a different place than we were a year ago.
I mean, it feels like amazing how much has changed in a year.
Yeah, it is amazing. Okay, but I don't want to end the discussion without talking about the ROGD Boys website. That's at
Right.
rogdboys.org. So that site is an incredible resource for parents of boys caught in the gender web and the clinicians wanting to gain some insight into the population and the reality of these interventions for males. The interventions from the affirmative care model. I know you had a role in creating that incredible site. Do you want to just pitch that site for briefly? Then we'll go to questions.
Absolutely. I had a minor role in creating that site. I mean, the work was done by an amazing group of parents because, a lot of these parents are scientists and professionals and lawyers and, college professors. There's so much experience, and they've just amassed this wealth of research. Um, they're an incredible support group. I've collaborated with them on their questionnaire, their survey that they're doing. It's just a great resource, and we did a GenSpect USA did a podcast when it was launched where I two anonymized parents and I talked about it, and then I wrote an article for Reality's Last Stand talking about the ROGD Boys cohort with reference to that website. So it's all out there. It's great. It's a great resource.
Yeah, it's incredible. It really is incredible. They did an amazing job, and yeah. So if you're interested or a parent, that's rogdboys.org. Also, if you are the parent of a boy, male lost in us, there's also parent support specifically for boys out there. And if you join ROG Parents of ROGD Kids you can find a way into that group as well. Another great resource for parents of boys. Okay, so we'll open up the discussion to questions. Please stick to the topic at hand. Please be brief so that we don't need to cut you off. And always know we'll definitely cut you off if you're not civil. If you hear during our Jerry Coyne space, you know that that's the case. If you want to ask a question and you find that you're having trouble getting elevated to speaker, or it seems like we're not hearing you, you're not able to ask your question, please try logging out and back in, or post your question in the feed, in the post, and then we'll do our best to get to them. So we have one question from someone who posted uh, in the feed. So I'll ask that one. If you have questions, go ahead and queue up. So the question was, how do you explain estrangement by sibling allies? The cruelty to parents is worsened.
You see this a lot, um, and I'm not sure exactly how I account for it, but I've seen so many cases of where there's a sibling. Usually, it's a sister with my group with the boys. There's a sister who's very supportive of the trans identification against the parents, and I've known parents who ended up losing contact um, with both children. And the psychology is interesting. It's a great question. I don't think I have a ready answer for it, but it's kind of like we often see that there's outside of the family as well. There's a female cheerleader that encourages the boy to transition and helps him with makeup and hair, and sometimes that can be within the family. I don't know. I actually know one parent who lost contact with all of her children, and it's just I wish I had an explanation, and I'm gonna think about it.
Okay, along those lines, and I meant to ask this earlier. Um, do, do you think it's possible to inoculate your child against this? Because at a certain point, they do stop listening to you.
Yeah, I think you have to do it really early on. I mean, I don't think you can inoculate them after they've had 3 or 4 years of gender ideology in school.
Mm.
Um, It has to start very early on. And honestly, if my children were at school age right now, I would not have them in school. I would not allow them to go through a public for any school that, I wasn't absolutely confident that gender ideology wasn't being taught because, it's just this unstoppable force. It's everywhere. It's in the schools,
Um,
it's in the professions, it's in the medical profession. And so how are you to fight that?
s-
So sorry, sorry?
yeah, yeah, is it me? You're going in and out a little bit for me. So can you repeat that answer?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm nothing has changed here. I'm
Okay.
talking the way I normally have. I think if you're going to inoculate them, it has to start really early on, like before they get to middle school for sure. But it's just a problem when everything, the medical profession. I mean, we all know these stories about doctors asking to see the child alone and then talking to them about their gender identity. Um, I just think the best thing is to keep your child out of it is to the extent you can.
Yeah, that's a tough one these
It
days.
is.
Um, okay. I'm not seeing anybody queuing up for questions. Every time I do this, then somebody jumps in at the last minute. But I think we we may have covered everything pretty well here um, in the discussion. So we'll yeah, I guess we're close. We're at two and a half, an hour and a half. Oh, there it goes. Yep. All right. Hold on. We have James DSD. We're going to promote uh, your, you should be able to speak now, James.
Oh, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi,
Okay, great.
James.
Yeah, hi. I was wondering, Joe, if you've noticed that, for instance, boys who have had their puberty blocked and then they go on to cross-sex hormones, their mental or development in their brains probably have not really matured. And so it's like they don't have the wiring. They become very docile, and they have other side effects mentally regarding that. Have you noticed any of that in your patients?
Um, I I in my very limited experience, I have one such patient, and I absolutely agree with what you're saying. There are cognitive deficits. There are horrible physical deficits. I mean, it was, being on a blocker and then going on cross-sex hormones during all that formative period, it's been a disaster. So yeah, I mean, and I'm not saying anything that he wouldn't say. He notices these deficits. He's concerned about them. He does seem fragile. He seems not. He seems young. He seems like much younger than his age. Um, it does stunts your development in all sorts of ways, and we'll see whether or not that's recoverable, right? I mean, I believe in critical periods, so I'm not super hopeful.
Okay. Um, yeah, there was a comment. Um, I think James made a comment about, yeah, this is about the memories, the recovered memories um, uh, period, and then the satanic panic with Diane Aronsoft being, central in both of those ideological medical scandals as well. She seems to be quite a fixture when it comes to damaging psychological scandals.
And she does not learn from her experience. She doesn't see that it's the same thing all over again. She regards as if it's entirely new and this is different from the last one. I mean, I don't know. The woman is a menace. I'm sorry.
Yeah, a menace. Agreed. Um, okay, we don't have anybody queued up, so we'll end here. Thank you so much, Joe, for joining us.
Well, you're really welcome. It was a pleasure, and I just want to say to any of the parents out there, feel free to reach out to me if you want to talk about anything. If it's a kind of a one-off consultation, I usually don't charge. I'm glad to just discuss your kids with you and see if there's any way I can be of help to you. So my email's joeburgo@gmail.com, and I'm available.
Great. Thank you so much for that. We have a few much needed weeks off, and then we'll be back at the end of the month with two more informative spaces. We'll be checking on the status of the various detrans lawsuits, and we'll be talking to a couple of therapists who are pushing back against the affirm only directive. If you haven't already done so, please join DIAG by clicking the join button at diag.org. That's di-ag.org. Our power to reach our lawmakers is through our numbers. It's important to show that we are a silent majority, maybe less silent now, who believe in classical liberal principles, following the science, including the reality of sex, ethical, evidence based medicine for all, the power of civil discourse and open dialogue, advocating for the rights of women and girls to sex based spaces, honors, and opportunities, LGBT rights, and the necessity of compassionate, reality based society where truth matters. Thank you all for joining us. Have a good rest of your evening. Bye bye.
Bye.